time some of these things happen are not exact, and so you'll have to tolerate some uncertainty here as I try to tell the story. So, the beginning. If I were going to choose a place to be in this story, it would probably be with the confession that I wasn't a good enough football player to be recruited to West Point. I grew up in a traditional household. I had a great deal of admiration for this country. It was a place I loved and esteemed enormously. And in my senior year, I had played high school football in New Mexico and been good enough to play in the annual North-South game. So one day a recruiter from West Point came to see me and my family and expressed some interest in arranging that I get an appointment to the academy. Suggested that was a possibility. In the meantime, of course, I was applying to other colleges. And as it turned out, I never heard from this recruiter again. My closest friend wound up going to West Point, and I think if I had made the grade and been offered an appointment to the academy, I probably would have gone, because I very much wanted to become a man, and I thought West Point was a place that might make that happen. And you can infer what that means about my understanding of masculinity at that point in time. So anyway, instead of going to West Point, I went to Stanford, and so here we come to a pretty critical junction in the story. At that point in time, all 800 freshman men lived in a single large complex, which was divided up into houses. And presiding over this whole business was a dean of freshman men, in this case, a man named Dwight Clark. Before these 800 people arrived each fall, Dwight sat down with photographs and brief biographies of all 800 and learned their names and to match them with pictures. And then he began circulating from one dining hall to another. He would stand in line to get food. He would be behind you in line. He would say, "You're Alan Williams, aren't you?" And you'd say, "Yes, I am." "My God, how did you know that?" And so Dwight was this extraordinary man. It took a long time, but I eventually learned he was a Quaker, and that made a great impression on me. What made an impression on me was the way in which he conducted himself and the way in which he lived his life. He lived with an inexhaustible goodwill toward other people, and with great simplicity. Dwight went on to found this organization called Volunteers in Asia after he ceased being Dean of Freshman Men at Stanford. And it's still going. Dwight is still alive, and he sent thousands of young people to Asia. And they go in the spirit of people who are there to be co-laborers and learners. Not people who have come to serve you, but people who have come to work with you and to learn from you. Anyway, this, as a consequence of getting to know Dwight and learning more about him, and subsequently then about the Quakers, I started to think about pacifism. And the more I thought about it, the more sense, and the more I read about it, the more sense it made to me. So this would have been in 1962, 63, 64. In my junior year in college, I had the opportunity to take a seminar on contemporary moral issues in the philosophy department. This gave me a further opportunity to think about some of these things. Then, of course, came the year 1965. So in the spring of 65, I was a junior in college. In the fall, I was a senior. Some of you are old enough around here to remember that 1965 was a critical year in the Vietnam War. A number of important decisions were made, but above all, the United States decided to commit combat troops. There were already 20,000 American troops, American servicemen and servicemen at that point in time in Vietnam. But in 1965, that number went to 180,000 as the first combat troops were deployed in Vietnam. It was in March of 1965 that the first teaching about the war was it took place at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. It was in October of 1965 that the first young man to return his draft card to the Selective Service System did so. It was in October also of 1965 that an American Quaker doused himself with gasoline in front of the Pentagon and burned himself to death. You may also remember that Vietnamese Buddhist monks were burning themselves to death in Saigon and elsewhere in Vietnam in protest against against the war, but also against the American involvement in it. It was in 1965 that the first large demonstrations against the war took place in 40 American cities, small compared to what would happen. And these demonstrations also began in Europe. So all of a sudden, this war became entangled in my whole effort to figure out what my relationship was to the religious tradition in which I had grown up. The religious tradition I'd grown up in was a Presbyterian church that my parents took me to on Sunday and dropped me off at, and then they went home and ate pancakes. Well, metaphysics, ontology, what exists in the world, that there was a spiritual side to us, and that spiritual side could be important in motivating us to do those things that are decent and good in the world rather than the other kinds of things to which our own desires and selfishness incline us. Anyway, so this war is going on, escalating. The monthly draft call in 1965 went from 17,000 per month to 35,000. The American government was obviously preparing itself to conduct a much larger war. So, as a consequence of having taken this seminar and had a chance to think more seriously and further about pacifism and nonviolence, as opposed to pacifism, presumably, and it was not in the hands of people like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, is not capitulation to injustice. Obviously, that's not that. It is another way of trying to transform a society that does not produce a cycle of unending violence and hatred and resentment. So I had concluded that I probably was a pacifist. I had become a pacifist. I certainly hadn't been. That's why I started the story where I did. And now my senior year loomed ahead of me. That time when you have to decide what the hell is going to happen next as you step out into a larger world. And I had won a fellowship to go to graduate school, Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, and I'd been admitted to several graduate schools. And I thought, this would be a reasonable path to take. But at the same time, as I watched the news and watched death rolls mount, I became more and more upset about the war. And in the Bay Area at that time, there were a number of people who opposed the war. It was a community of such people. And I decided that, first of all, I was a pacifist and I should apply for conscientious objection. So some of you are too young to remember that there was a draft and everybody was subject to it. But the United States had a law which made it possible for somebody to apply for conscientious objection, engaging in killing. And one has to be grateful for that law. So I applied for conscientious objection, And I thought I would try to serve the country for a couple of years doing something that was constructive, not destructive. And I also thought that I would have time to do what I could to work to persuade my fellow citizens that the war was a bad idea. And at that time in 1965, a majority of the American public, something just over 60% of the American public, supported an increase in American forces in Vietnam, further engagement there. So then once you apply, you had a local draft board. They make the decision. In my case, it was Albuquerque. The man who sat on that draft board decided that the only people entitled to this status were people who came from traditional pacifist churches. So the Quakers, the Brethren, the Mennonites, those folks. And I didn't come from that background. So they rejected my application. If your application was rejected, you could then appeal, and a local official of some kind was appointed to adjudicate this matter or to make a recommendation to the Selective Service System. So, but the thing about all of this is that once you get caught up in the machinations of government, legal trials or these kinds of processes, they drag on. The mills of the gods do grind slowly, and we're not gods. Our lives are short and brief. And so all of this, so I graduated from college in 1966, and a quick story about that's involved in this. This is what happened to me. But in the fall, after I graduated, I came back to Albuquerque, and this hearing was held, at which I was invited to introduce evidence that I should be granted CEGOP status. And the man who presided over this was a former federal judge. So I did that, and ultimately he recommended I be granted this status. But ultimately the determination was in the hands of the Selective Service System. So set that aside for a moment, because all of that is taking time to make its way along. Meanwhile, you have to go on living your life as best you can. So I graduated in 1966. Through Dwight's organization, I had a chance to go to Vietnam in the summer of 1966. And I was sent to what was called 4th Corps Region, which was the South. Vietnam was divided into Army Corps units. I Corps, 1 Corps was up in the north, along the border. I was sent to the 4th Corps Region, which was down in the south, the largest city in the south, which is Cam Tho. And I was going to be there for several months, with the possibility of staying on for another couple of years. So, and what I was doing came to seem in my eyes a kind of cultural imperialism. I was working with English language teachers in a Vietnamese high school, and with some Cambodian Buddhist monks who wanted to work on English. That's what I was doing while I was living there. Okay, so one day I'd been at the Stanford campus in Germany, and I had a German friend, a former German professor, who sent me some money. He knew I was there, and he said, look, I wish this war were not happening. I would like to do something constructive. You're there. Can you take this money and do something constructive with it? So I didn't know what to do with this money, but I thought, well, I'll give it to the Vietnamese Red Cross. So I went to the trailer out of which the Vietnamese Red Cross operated. And as I was opening the door, another man was pulling it to come out, and we ran into one another. And he was a doctor. He was the only one in the office, and he clearly was in a hurry. He asked me what I wanted. I explained as briefly as I could. We were speaking French. He did not speak English, and I didn't speak Vietnamese. Although I did pick up a phrase book as soon as I got to the Saigon airport, and it was full of interesting and useful expressions like, don't shoot, I'm a friend, and things like that. So anyway, he said he had to go to the hospital because a terrible thing had just happened, and he had to be there, and could I please come back? And I said, of course. And he started away, and then he turned around and he said, would you come with me?
I need there'll be a representative of the American Red Cross there. He doesn't speak French or Vietnamese, and would you interpret for us? So I went. And what we were there to do is to talk with as many victims as we could of an American bombing that had occurred. There were no ground forces in 4 Corps at that point in time, but the CIA was there. There were a lot of American personnel. The American Air Force operated there, of course. And upstream, up a branch of the Mekong, there was a village, and this part of Vietnam is cut by small streams and whatnot that people used to get about. And the Viet Cong had set up a toll station along one of these small rivulets, and they were exacting tolls from people who wanted to pass by. This is probably a couple of guys, maybe 4 guys, something like that. 2 American Phantom jets were called in, and they not only attacked this post, but they attacked the nearby village. And they killed about somewhere between 50 and 100 people, and they wounded as many people as they had killed. And they used conventional bombs, and they used napalm. And so we get to the hospital, and the job is we go from bed to bed to bed to bed, and the Vietnamese doctor asks if anybody in the bed can speak, and is willing to do so. He asks what happened to them. They tell him. He translates that for me into French. Then I translate it into English for the American representative of the Red Cross. So what I heard were about 25 heartbreaking stories, and the last bed that we came to contained a woman and 2 of her children. All of them had lost at least a portion of one limb, in one case more than that. They were burned by napalm. The woman was hysterical. They were in pain. They were all in one bed again, I say, and that was true. There were multiple people in a lot of beds. But anyway, she was hysterical because, as it turned out, she had a baby who had been taken from her, and this baby apparently, we learned subsequently, had been so badly burned that they couldn't treat this baby in Can Tho. It was flown to the only real burn unit that existed, which was a military burn unit in Saigon. Anyway, I walked out of that hospital more convinced than ever, not intellectually now, but as deep in my gut as anything goes, that nothing in the world justified doing this to people. And so I also concluded that the most important thing I could be doing was doing what I could to put an end to this war. It was not teaching English to Vietnamese English instructors in a high school. So I opted not to stay for another 2 years. I came back to the United States. I went to work for the American Friends Service Committee in Philadelphia. And here, so I worked with them for almost a year in Philadelphia and then another year in San Francisco. And 2 things happened. One in Philadelphia and one in San Francisco that entrenched this feeling that began to seriously that entrenched my own sense of responsibility. So anyway, in Philadelphia, I tried on Sundays to go to different meetings, just to experience the different Quaker meetings in the Philadelphia area. And I will say at one of these, I also lived with a Quaker couple while I was in Philadelphia for a while, and these were people who were trying to be Quakers. It didn't come out of the goodwill that I'd seen in Dwight, and that we see in some people, the sort of shining openness to the world, the readiness to welcome other people. it wasn't, they were trying to make that happen, but it wasn't happening. It was an effort for them. There were two, surprising, there were two elderly women at one of these meetings who were luminescent. They are the closest thing I've ever seen to what one might think of as a saint. Of course, I didn't know them well, but just something emanated from them. You sit silently, and if you're moved, you go. So that's how I witnessed what they were doing. And then I went to this conference the Quakers were holding, and it was essentially an exploration of alternative means of trying to stop the war. The political road was not working, it seemed. And so, if you're going to try to stop a state from conducting a war, what can you do? Well, the two things that had occurred to people was cut off the money, stop paying your taxes, and the other is deny them the bodies that make up their military force. So, at this particular gathering, I sat in on a panel which involved tax resistance. Well, if any of you have not paid your taxes, you discover that it's virtually impossible to do this. They will take your home. They can take whatever money you have in a bank. They will take your car. So it is extraordinarily difficult to live any kind of ordinary life and refuse to pay your taxes. But there were several Quaker women who had been doing this. And you got one more. It was the year in which the March on the Pentagon occurred in October of 1967. The whole week that preceded this March on the Pentagon was called Stop the Draft Week. And in the Bay Area and elsewhere, there was this movement called the Resistance. And it was an effort to persuade young men not to submit to induction. So if you can't cut off the money, maybe you can cut off the supply of manpower. And so people went to induction centers and they handed out leaflets. Initially it was guys who went to induction centers. And busloads of guys who had been drafted would get off the bus, and these guys would come up to them and hand them leaflets, and it just led to a lot of confrontations. So finally, the resistance figured out that it was a whole lot smarter to have young women hand out these leaflets to the guys who were getting off the buses, and so that was going on. And every morning at the Oakland Induction Center, so now we're in the Bay Area, 10 or 12 buses would show up at the induction center. It was taking in people from all over Northern California. And during that week, students from Berkeley and other places across the Bay Area demonstrated outside the induction center. And there was well, I don't want to get into the details of that too much, but all right. So on Friday, the March on the Pentagon was going to occur on Saturday. That was the culmination of the Norman Mailer's Armies of the Night or something like that. The book he wrote about this, when 100,000 people marched on the Pentagon in the following day on Saturday, and the American government prepared to defend the Pentagon. And called in a brigade of the 82nd Airborne to hold in reserve and so on. Anyway, on that Friday in Oakland, there was a very, very large crowd massed in front of the induction center and all around it. And diagonally across from the induction center, there was a huge parking garage, and it was filled with California Highway Patrol cars. Police from all over Northern California had been called in. And so at one point, and the crowd was trying to deny the buses access to the induction center. These people could not be taken in. So at one point, the police are massing in this garage,
And then they march out in formation with their shields and their clubs and other accoutrements and plastic face masks. And up on top of the induction center, a senior police official is saying to the crowd in front of the induction center, in the name of the people of the state of California, I order you to disperse. In the name of the people of the state of California, I order you to disperse. And then people started shouting, we are the people. We are the people. So then the order was given and the police moved forward. And I happened to be in the street in front of the induction center. And was standing there, you can't see very much. There's the induction center on this side and a parking lot across on this side with a wall. And all of a sudden, people are pressing against you as the police are forcing their way forward. And they are using clubs and they're using mace. And all of a sudden, 2 rows in front of me, there are these cops swinging clubs. And there was no place really to go except I got to the left and I got over a wall. And I turned around and I looked back and there were, again, Quakers sitting in front of the induction center, blocking the entryway and along out beyond that. And I saw the police wielding their clubs against these people, smashing them in the head, and blood spurting onto the windows, screaming. So that day, and then the crowd broke up into these sort of roving gangs that closed down downtown Oakland for half a day, turning over cars and all kinds of stuff. Anyway, I mention all of that because that day, again, was emotionally arousing. And what I saw was a vicious government willing to do whatever it had to ingest. Now it wouldn't have been 35,000 people they were taking a month, but many more than that, because in '67 there were close to 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. So now back to me. This whole process has gone through several stages. Finally, the Secretary of Service System said, no, you can't be a conscientious objector. We're ordering you for induction. So if you're going to say anything in open court except, yes, I did refuse induction, and then be sentenced to up to 5 years in prison, you have to comply with that induction order. That is to say, you have to go through the physical, you have to do everything they want you to, but at the end you get to a point where there's a line on the floor, and you stand in front of the line and they ask you to step across the line, and then you take an oath. And if you go up to that point, you've complied with all of the procedures that you have to so that you can raise other issues in court. So I did all of that. And I went through a first trial, and I was, I didn't have any money. I had a public defender, a really nice guy who wanted to help me. He got me off on a technicality. But I didn't want to get off on a technicality because I was in love with somebody in my life. I wanted my life to go on. I wanted to get this settled. If I got to go to jail, let me go to jail and get it over with. I don't want to go through more of this. Because I knew what would happen is that I would just be ordered for... Anyway, in the midst of all this, I just got sufficiently angry that I sent my draft cards back. And once you do that, they reclassify you. So anyway, after 2 years, I decided I'm going to go to graduate school. And I'm just going to wait. I'm going to start now on my life, and I'll do what I can, and I'll wait for the next trial, and we'll see what happens. And I can get this behind me. So after 2 years of working with the Quakers, I went to graduate school. And during that year, I waited to be arrested because I had sent my cards back, and I knew they would come and get me. And so one day in the spring of that first year, I was going back to the Hall of Graduate Studies,
I passed this guy who lived on my hall. He was, I don't know, he was from the Middle East or Europe or someplace. Anyway, he said, "Don't go back to your room. There are men are waiting for you." So I knew that the time had come. All right. I won't go on with that part of the story. Just have to back up to that first year, because this is where the atheism comes in. So in the fall of 1968, when I started graduate school, I was struggling, was still trying to on a sense that there was a higher being, that whose will took precedence over that of states. And so I went to see the chaplain at Yale, a guy named William Sloane Coffin, who is an extraordinarily interesting person. If none of you go read about William Sloane Coffin Jr. in Wikipedia. Coffin himself had in '68. He and Benjamin Spock and three other guys published a call to resist the illegitimate authority of the United States government, and they were prosecuted for this in 1968. But anyway, I went to see Coffin. Enormously imposing man. He came out of the elite in New York City. He had been he had been educated in France. He was a brilliant pianist. He studied with Nadia Boulanger in Paris for a time. He'd worked with